These are the best guys that ever flew.
I mean, we were like a ladybug on the end of a whip antenna, an old-fashioned antenna on your car.
They're going to send us to the moon.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All engines running. Launch commit.
When Apollo 8 launched on the morning of December 21st, 1968, the 3 American astronauts atop the massive Saturn V rocket boldly went where no man had gone before. Over the course of the next 6 days, William Anders, James Lovell, and Frank Borman would achieve numerous towering milestones.
I do think this is not just the greatest space mission that NASA ever ran. I think it's one of the great explorations in humanity's history.
3 hours after liftoff, the astronauts became the first humans to leave low Earth orbit. 2.5 days later, they were the first to enter the moon's gravitational well. Then the first to see the side of the moon Earthlings had never seen with their own eyes. They were also the first humans to view their home planet in its entirety.
As we came around the moon, we suddenly saw the Earth, which was a small blue and white ball, realizing that behind my thumb there was about 5 billion people and everything I ever knew.
Apollo 8 proved that reaching the cosmic body humans had only ever seen from afar could be done. But at the time, the mission was extremely dangerous, with no guarantees that it would end well.
Well, it always embarrassed me when people would say, oh, gee, that was so dangerous on Apollo 8. And yet, we all had colleagues over in Vietnam who were being shot at.
As the 50th anniversary of the monumental Apollo 8 voyage approaches, astronauts Anders, Lovell, and Borman reunited at the Museum of Science and Industry last week to celebrate a new book titled Rocket Men. It recounts their astounding journey. It's by former Chicago Sun-Times reporter Robert Kurson, who says the idea to write it was sparked by his discovery that the Apollo 8 capsule, along with Frank Borman's spacesuit, are housed at the Museum of Science and Industry.
I was mystified. I didn't know very much about Apollo 8, if anything, and I considered myself a fan of space and astronauts and space explorations.
Kurson's book is based on new interviews with the 3 Apollo 8 astronauts, and among other things, provides new insights into the challenges and pressures their wives endured.
All they did was pitch in and help and maintain a family, raise their kids, and do everything else. And they did it with pride because they were as much a part of this deal as we were, really.
The book also goes in depth into the Cold War standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union that launched the space race. In 1957, the Soviets began what would be a series of humiliations to the U.S. space program by launching Sputnik, the first spacecraft to enter Earth orbit. In 1959, the Soviet probe Luna 2 was the first spacecraft to make a hard landing on the moon. Later that year, Luna 3 took the first photograph of the far side of the moon. And in April 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, beating the United States and astronaut John Glenn by nearly a year. Then President Kennedy issued his famous challenge.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Through the 1960s, the Soviets kept besting NASA as the space agency suffered delays and setbacks. Kennedy's 1969 deadline seemed increasingly out of reach until mid-1968.
2 things happened in the summer of 1968 that changed the whole thing completely. The first thing was the fact that we had intelligence information that the Russians were going to put a man or men circumnavigate the moon. And the second thing we found out was the fact that Grumman Aircraft, who built the lunar module, wouldn't get it ready for a 1968 flight.
The decision was made to head to the moon without the lunar landing module. Without it, the command module would have only one engine to return to Earth. If it failed, the astronauts were doomed. But in August 1968, Anders, Lovell, and Borman began a 4-month training for liftoff, a process that normally took a year and a half.
One of the remarkable things about NASA at that time, people that were there all were willing to subordinate every factor of their life, their families, their health, everything, to the success of the mission. From Jim Webb, the administrator, down to the lowest employee at NASA wanted to win, wanted to beat the Russians to the moon.
5 days before Christmas 1968, the Apollo 8 crew entered the tiny capsule on the tip of the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built, producing the force of a small nuclear bomb.
The mighty Saturn V, the only machine powerful enough to deliver men to the moon, had only been tested twice, both times unmanned, and the second time was a near disaster, a failure after failure.
Rocketman recounts many of the tense moments of the landmark voyage, including when Frank Borman succumbed to motion sickness just as the astronauts left Earth orbit. Mission Control became very concerned and considered aborting the mission.
There's no way in God's green earth that I was going to cancel it because I puked a couple times.
Apollo 8 made 10 orbits around the moon, including one on Christmas Day when they broadcast live a biblical reading to the home planet 240,000 miles away.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
All three astronauts had cameras to photograph potential landing sites for future Apollo missions, but only William Anders had color film in his camera, and he took what became one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century, Earthrise over the moon. Jim Lovell and Frank Borman are now 90 years old. William Anders is 84. But their memories of the daring and historic voyage are as fresh as they were a half-century ago.
I think that we were like three schoolboys looking through a candy store window.
It's no secret the Apollo 8 mission ended in triumph, but 8 months later it was overshadowed by Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon. Even Armstrong admitted that his historic achievement would have been impossible without the risk undertaken by Apollo 8. The mission also proved a fitting ending to 1968.
We got back, and Frank got a telegram or a message saying, thank you, you saved 1968.
The astronauts were lauded with ticker tape parades in several cities, including Chicago. And the Apollo 8 astronauts ensured that the United States would forever be acknowledged as the first country to visit an out-of-this-world destination. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Eddie Aruza.